Hello, and welcome to episode 195 of Prose. This week, live a bucolic dream in the crab orchards, and ride through a city as a ghastly being seduces the masses. Please consider heading to prosepodcast.com, our one-stop shop for all things prose. There you can find links to social media, the episodes, a shop for swag, the show's Patreon, and more. On social media, like and share away. Most importantly, please do consider subscribing, rating, and or reviewing wherever you grab your podcasts and music. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tales, shall we? This week we have Harvest Time and the Chaddick. Enjoy. Harvest Time, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. It was briny out, so the crab orchards were in full bloom, the clacking from awakened claws echoing through the boughs of the orchard. The air was thick with salt, enough to burn the nose when walking among the squat, hulking trees. So far from Dolai Shara, the harvest trying to scuttle and snip its way from the heavily laden branches would mean a feast for the farmers this evening. They would save the best for sale. There was too much at stake to eat away such a grand harvest, but they would have full bellies and a grand time on the leaner, smaller crabs once the collection was complete. Skynar couldn't remember the last time the trees were bent under so much weight. The boughs were bowing down to where the occasional crab would break from its stem and seek to scuttle off into the distance. Little did the beasts know that they were a rather long trek from the sea. Still, sometimes they would make it to a stream or the estuary of the river, which meant freedom for them and one less bite to eat or parcel to sell for the farmers. Even the irrigation ditches could serve as a means of escape for an industrious crab running from the harvest. Thus the younger boys and girls of the orchards were tasked with keeping a sharp eye and chasing down any of these wayward crabs seeking to disappear into the nearby waters. Harvest time was Skynar's favorite time of the year. Of course, that could be said of all the orchard workers. The heat was not gone, but the edge of it had dulled somewhat, meaning that the air would crisp and crinkle soon. Without the brutality of the heat of much of the orchard work, the tenders could work with one less fear, as they could largely discount the ravages of heat exhaustion amid their toil. Putting on the thick leather gloves and thin leather aprons necessary to pick the mature crabs from the trees was not burdensome, as the air cooled and winds strengthened. The lean times would also be lessened with the harvest. By no means would any family that lived and worked the great crab orchards become wealthy. But, in addition to being well and truly full for the first time in a season, they would make enough coin to mend clothing and buckets, purchase seedlings and crablings for this year's planting, and, if they were truly lucky, allow the infirmed among them to travel to the nearby village to see the country physicier that the Council of Dolai Shara had assigned to the small hamlet for the strict purpose of serving the surrounding communities. Unfortunately, the physicier, like most Skynar met from the city, was ruled by the purse. So coin was the only way to get his true attention. The heavier the purse, the better the care. It was becoming more and more difficult to revel in the harvest and love the life he had always loved with the news coming out from the wider world. Skynar purpled a bit thinking about it, having to pause a moment from his plucking of crabs down from the branches to breathe easily and allow a cool, salty breeze to push away his disquieting thoughts. On a bad day, the orchards could just catch a whiff of the infamous Kalado mank. Even this far out and away from the city, people knew of the district of the fields and its festering wound of a catch-all body of water. The tinge of wastewater came along down the Ardon River once a month, and the outland peoples could always tell when the dams, dikes, and locks were open. Along with the monthly stench, news came pouring out of the city, though far more quickly than once a month. A man named Apple Thief Charlie led a host of resurrected men in defiance of the council and the merchants of the city. Umasa Grounds was a charnel house where bellicose rebels were slaughtered by the city's soldiers. A great beast had lured some of the best and brightest of the city into a hypnotic ecstasy of religious fervor and gained followers unto itself. Those of the knowing were terrified. Stereoma, the great cloud city, was crumbling, and with it, the martial prowess of Dolai Shara. Long gone was the wren nest of the lauded Wind Riders. Dark soldiers and a bejeweled emissary from the pauper emperor of a neighboring juggernaut nation, the man being known as the Mendicant King, came to the city and ignored Dol Aisharan custom and shamed its royalty by taking a commoner to wife. Most of the news made little sense to Skynar. Most of it sounded like the ramblings of a madman or a teller who has had too many drinks at the midwinter telling. As if they needed all of this madness filtering to them from that sore of a city anyway. They had enough problems on their own. Tending the crab orchards was a trying life, a hard life, and the wilds came with challenges that would make a Dol Aisharan cringe and cry for their mother. Just last harvest time, one of the famed flim-flam men that traveled the lands far and wide had come and spent time among the orchards. The flim-flam man warned that the air serpent flocks were coming in from the western reaches earlier than usual. the assemblage, who had just moments before been in great spirits, listening to his tales of the vast world and eager to purchase small trinkets and oddities with what meager savings they had scrounged in hopes that just such a day would come, gasped. The men taking off their hats and wringing them, and women holding their children a bit closer. Everyone looking at once terrified and fierce. The air serpent flocks were a bane on the world, and doubly so for those of the crab orchards. Clouds of flying snakes, choking the skies, writhing through the air, would roil into the rows of trees, the fanged beasts taking what crabs they might as prey. To have a flock come meant ruin for entire communities. But Skynar's very own Da had rallied all the families of their quadrant. He had all the people collect the bark shed from the great trees, and everyone, even the smallest babes and oldest beldams, wove enormous nets by hand. In a matter of days, they had produced nets like the world had never seen. The grid pattern so tightly woven that none but the smallest, youngest serpents might get through. And those younglings were not so brave as to rush into the orchards without their sires. The people mounted them on taller oak trees around the quadrant of the orchard and encouraged all their neighbors to do the same. When the air serpent flocks did come, the people were ready. They were outfitted head to toe in the same gear that they collected their crabs in, wagering that the thick gloves that everyone wore, along with the thin aprons worn to protect their fronts, but worn double so backs were protected too, some additional gloves tied around arms and legs and necks, and an assortment of makeshift helmets in the form of buckets and sewn together rags and such. Well, all those would keep those damn worms from sinking venomous fangs into flesh. The nets did precisely what the nets were intended to do. But the men of the orchards still had to drive the serpents away from the town and its people and livestock. They banged and clanged pots and pans, using them as cudgels in order to scare the beasts and encouraging them to fly in the directions they wanted them to. The fight was long, and the serpents were nothing if not persistent in their efforts to overrun the men. But the men prevailed in the end, and when the peoples of the orchards saw the last wings flapping and tails writhing off over the horizon, they cheered like Skynar had never heard them cheer. Jubilation, joy of living. And with that brave action, the peoples of the crab orchards knew that the flocks would likely not be back for a generation, as the winds would shift and make a return difficult, and the flock's memory would serve that there were no meals to be had in these lands. They would hunt easier prey on fairer winds. So, monsters and revolution were all fine and good for Dolai Shara. But there in the crab orchards, they fought for survival all day, every day. They did not have time to think of grand notions like republicanism and religiosity. Then again, that was precisely what Skynar was doing as he continued plucking crabs and plopping them down into his large burlap sack, moving deliberately in his work. Pluck, toss, clack. Pluck, toss, clack. Pluck, toss, clack. The rhythm soothed Skynar into easy thought, and those thoughts kept returning to Dol Ishara. Maybe if he went to the city, he could see the truths of these tales. Maybe if he went to the city, he could petition the council for a more honest physiker. Maybe if he went to the city, he could gin up greater interest in the crabs from the orchard, resulting in more wealth coming the way of his people, to all his people. Pluck, toss, clack. Pluck, toss, clack. Pluck, toss, clack. The brackish breeze had really picked up,
Pluck, toss, clack.
making the crabs
Pluck,
sway
toss,
with the
clack.
unseen hands of the world,
Pluck, toss,
and
clack.
turning the waning day
Pluck,
into
toss,
one of
clack.
beauty.
Pluck, toss, clack.
But
Pluck,
Skynar
toss, clack.
could
Pluck,
not enjoy the
toss,
harvest time as once he did.
Pluck, toss, clack.
He was already
Pluck,
elsewhere,
toss, clack. Pluck,
somewhat
toss,
against his
clack.
will,
Pluck, toss, clack.
and the seeds of a dream
Pluck, toss, clack. Pluck,
were being
toss,
sown.
clack. Pluck, toss, 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 clack.
Thank you for listening to Harvest Time, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. This story is part of the larger Dol Ishara world. For those that have been listening for some time, that includes Apple Thief Charlie, the Chaddick living in the firmament, and the Mendicant King. As it is the spooky season, I will include the Chaddick, another short story, in the world of all things Dol Ishara here. Stick around and enjoy. The Chaddick, an original short story by Jared I. McGee.
The Chaddick. They come. They are legion. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. They are many in one. They are the next evolution. They have always been among us, but only now do they show themselves as the Chaddick. What are their motivations? They see the in and out of the packed streets of Dol-Ishara, sniffing out others like them, like-minded, weak-minded denizens of the great capital. People who thought they were learning and gaining independence when, in reality, they were ripening themselves for brainwashing, for being given a way to walk, a way to talk, a way to think. The Chaddick sought out the up-and-coming middle-class merchants' children that were consuming the newest pamphlets and treatises coming out of the minds and pens of the literati. The Chaddick scanned the crowds for intelligent peoples of the fields, up from the slums to try to scrape out a better life, their minds roiling and fertile for the seeds they wanted to plant there, the seeds that would see the Chaddick make those starving peasants like them. Legion, the many, in one. With the stink of the bubbling cesspool that was Kalado Mank, the peasants were actually still the harder catch. Their emaciated frames hid strong souls beneath them. The Chaddick preferred to prey upon those that thought they were intelligent. Those people that had just enough education to consider themselves cosmopolitan. The people that hungered for acceptance and confirmation to all the biases they already held.
We must help the dying of the fields.
Indeed, whispered the Chaddick.
We must drain the disease-ridden Kalado Mank.
You are so wise, hissed the Chaddick.
We must value the lives of our brothers and sisters who are less fortunate.
Such a brave and original declaration, asserted the Chaddick. The sheep had their unoriginal ideas applauded by them, and they oohed and gooed honeyed agreements. Once the bond was established, the sheep listened to anything the Chaddick professed. And they were just that. The professor of these students of alternate realities, shifted ways of looking and thinking. The obvious and pedestrian takes that these mediocre minds espoused opened the door for the Chaddick to build barriers against open thought. They walled off those open minds from anything resembling intellectual openness. More importantly to the assimilation, the Chaddick preached the gospel of collective thought. Their ways were the right ways. They were them, and them were they. The Chaddick convinced the sheep that everyone in Dol-Ishara was the same while utterly different. Those differences in need of celebration and protection. The Chaddick planted in their pupils' minds many such conflicted pairings. Cognitive dissonance rang out with every sermon, but the sheep simply listened and lapped up the nonsensical holdings. The Chaddick espoused the danger of freely thinking while celebrating the sheep's open minds. This would serve them the best of all the plantings. With every flushing of the sewer networks, the city was renewed. With every lunar cycle, they gathered more followers. 3 more revitalizations of Kalado Mank would see their chief disciples ready to go out and spread the word further throughout the city. 5 more, at most. Then, Dol-Ishara would see both violent and non-violent approaches to making them. Their ways would become the right ways, the only ways. They would become them, and them would become they. The merchant quarters avenues were already popping with their revolutionaries. Soon, the Chaddick would send their converted underlings into the fields to set up boxes from which they could shout the grand message in Umata grounds. There, the poor could not help but hear the wonderful message that would bring the sundry peoples of the city under one religion. The religion of groupthink. The religion of contradiction and faux fact. The Chaddick chuffed and grunted with delight, even thinking about it. How easy it was to draw in these fools who thought themselves so advanced. The only two groups standing in their way were the conservatives and the knowing. The former were simply backward thinkers, lovers of tradition for tradition's sake, those attached to their religions, and who wanted a different type of conformity and homogeneity. The latter might profess to have magic, those knowing, but they were men and women of the mind. Nothing more. They studied the natural world and recorded and labeled and explained all the happenstances thereof and therein. They were more dangerous than those backward conservatives. They knew what real fact was. They relied on observation and numbers, reality as based in evidence. They could see through the false claims and nonsensical contradictory beliefs that Chaddick sought throughout their people's minds. The Chaddick knew those two groups would not let loose of their own worldviews. This meant that they would need to recruit greater numbers than the conservatives and the knowings numbers combined. This was a challenge, but it was far from the impossible, especially for the Chaddick. Just yesterday, the magistrates rang the bell and sent out their dogs to chase down some poor man from the fields for stealing some apples. Apples! That type of horrendous treatment would push the people even more into the clutches of the Chaddick. Those foolish magistrates. With every passing day, the Chaddick found new ways of telling the disparate peoples coming under their banner that they actually were the only way. Their teachings were the only teachings, even though those peoples and those teachings went against one another, hated one another, mixed as if oil with water. The madness that these sheep would so easily believe such strange labyrinthine findings. The hoops those sheep leapt through to make this belief system make logical sense to them. It was amazing. The Chaddick did not have to build those labyrinths either. The sheep, particularly the most ardent disciples, made the connection and glued together the faux logic for them. Huh, what fun. What ease. All this for what, though? The Chaddick's motives were often questioned by their flock. Placating gestures and answers were the norm, but they were all lies. All of them. Because the Chaddick, they come. They are Legion. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them. They are many in one. They are the next evolution. They have always been among us, but only now do they show themselves as the Chaddick. What are their motivations? Only to take over this world of ours. Nothing more. Nothing less.
Thank you for listening to The Chaddick, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. All sounds and music that you have heard throughout this episode come from YouTube's free audio music library and freesound.org. All of those tracks are being used under CC 01.0 public domain dedication licenses. That does it this week for Prose. As you continue about your day, I do hope that you'll love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is always stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.